The storm had come through fast and mean, the way they do in late October when the seasons are fighting over who gets to claim the land. Walter Hensley had seen it building all afternoon, the sky turning green at the edges, the wind picking up until the old oak by the barn was bending like it wanted to touch the ground. He'd gotten the horses into the stable and the chickens into the coop, and was halfway back to the house when the rain hit. Sheets of water so thick he could barely see his hand in front of his face. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. The fields were waterlogged, the creek that ran along the property line had jumped its banks, and the county road that connected Walter's farm to the rest of civilization was a river of mud and debris. Walter was 73 years old. He'd been farming this land since he was 19, when he'd inherited it from his father, who'd inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Hensleys had worked these 200 acres, had pulled crops from the soil and raised livestock and built something that mattered. Now it was just Walter, alone, since his wife Margaret had passed 4 years ago, working land that was too big for one man but too precious to sell. He pulled on his boots and his work coat and walked out to survey the damage. The barn had lost a few shingles, nothing serious. The fence along the north pasture had come down in 2 places, which meant a day of repairs. The tractor was where he'd left it, covered in mud but otherwise fine. All in all, not bad. He'd seen worse storms do worse things. He was walking back toward the house, making a mental list of what needed fixing, when he heard the sound. At first, he thought it was an animal, a cow in distress maybe, or one of the horses that had spooked and gotten loose, but as he listened, he realized it was something else, something mechanical. The whine of an engine trying to turn over and failing, followed by silence, followed by the whine again. Walter followed the sound down the long driveway to the county road. The road was worse than he'd expected, deep ruts carved by the runoff, branches and debris scattered across the pavement. And there, in the ditch on the far side, was a motorcycle. It was lying on its side, half buried in mud, the front wheel bent at an angle that meant it wasn't going anywhere on its own power. Beside it, trying to lift it upright, was a man. He was big. That was Walter's first impression. Broad shoulders, thick arms, the kind of build that came from a life of physical work. His leather jacket was soaked and covered in mud, and his gray hair was plastered to his skull. He was favoring his left leg, and even from a distance, Walter could see the grimace of pain on his face every time he tried to lift the bike. "Hey there," Walter called out, picking his way across the road toward the ditch. "You need a hand?" The man looked up, startled. His eyes were gray, the color of the sky after the storm, and they held the wary look of someone who wasn't used to accepting help. "Bike went down in the storm," he said, his voice rough. "Hit a patch of mud I didn't see. Couldn't get it up on my own." "I can see that." Walter climbed down into the ditch, his boots sinking into the muck. "Let's see what we can do." Together, they managed to get the motorcycle upright. It was heavier than Walter had expected, and by the time they had it standing, both men were breathing hard. The front wheel was definitely bent, and something was leaking from the engine. Oil, maybe, or coolant. It wasn't going anywhere. "You hurt?" Walter asked, looking at the way the man was standing, his weight shifted off his left leg. "Twisted my knee when I went down. Nothing serious." "Looks serious enough to me." Walter squinted at the sky, which was clearing now, patches of blue breaking through the gray. "You got someone you can call? Tow truck, maybe?" The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. He looked at it, then shook his head. "Dead. Must have gotten wet in the crash." "Well." Walter looked at the motorcycle, then at the man, then at his farm stretching out behind them. "I've got a phone you can use, and a warm place to dry off while you wait. Come on." The man hesitated. Walter could see him weighing his options, calculating the risks of following a stranger versus the reality of standing in a muddy ditch with a broken bike and a bad knee. "Name's Walter," Walter said, holding out his hand. "Walter Hensley. I've lived on that farm for 54 years. I'm not going to rob you or kill you. Just offering a cup of coffee and a dry chair." Something shifted in the man's expression, a crack in the wariness, a hint of something that might have been amusement. "Earl," he said, taking Walter's hand. His grip was firm despite the mud. "Most people call me Shepherd." They got the motorcycle off the road, dragging it to the edge of Walter's property, where it would be out of the way until a tow could come. Then Walter led Shepherd up the long driveway, past the barn and the stable and the vegetable garden that Margaret had planted 20 years ago, and Walter still maintained in her memory. The farmhouse was old but well kept, white clapboard, green shutters, a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Walter led Shepard inside, through a mudroom filled with boots and coats and the accumulated debris of a working farm, into a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 1980s, but was clean and warm and smelled like coffee. "Sit," Walter said, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table. "I'll get you something dry to wear." He came back with a flannel shirt and a pair of work pants that had belonged to his son, who had moved to Chicago 15 years ago and rarely visited. Shepard changed in the bathroom and emerged looking slightly less like a drowned rat, though his knee was clearly still, bothering him. Walter poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Shepard, then lowered himself into the chair across the table. "Phone's on the wall," he said. "Make whatever calls you need." Shepard wrapped his hands around the mug, the same gesture Walter had seen his father make 1,000 times, his grandfather before that. The universal language of men who worked with their hands and appreciated warmth when they could find it. "Thank you," Shepard said, "for pulling me out of that ditch, for all of this." Anyone would have done the same. No. Shepard's gray eyes met Walter's. They wouldn't. Most people would have driven right past, figured it was someone else's problem. You stopped. You helped. He paused. "That matters." Walter shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just being neighborly, way I was raised." They sat in silence for a moment, drinking their coffee, listening to the old house settle around them. Through the window, Walter could see the damage the storm had done, the downed fence, the scattered debris, the mud that would take days to clear. It was going to be a lot of work, and he wasn't as young as he used to be. Shepard seemed to be looking at the same thing. "Big place," he said. "You work it alone?" "Have for 4 years since my wife passed. Kids are grown and gone. It's just me and the land." "That's a lot for one man." "It is." Walter took a sip of his coffee. "Some days I think about selling, moving into town, getting a little apartment where someone else worries about the roof and the fences. But then I walk out in the morning and see the sun coming up over those fields, and I can't imagine being anywhere else." He shook his head. "This place is in my blood. My family's been here for 100 years. I'll be here until they carry me out." Shepard nodded slowly, like he understood something that didn't need to be said. "Let me make my calls," he said, standing carefully. "Get a tow arranged, then I'll be out of your hair." He limped to the phone on the wall and dialed a number from memory. Walter listened with half an ear as Shepard spoke to someone about the motorcycle, about the accident, about where he was and what he needed. The conversation was brief, efficient, the kind of exchange between people who had done this before. When he hung up, Shepard turned back to Walter. "Tow truck can't get here until tomorrow. Roads are too bad. They'll send someone in the morning." Walter considered this. A stranger in his house overnight. 20 years ago, he wouldn't have thought twice. Now, with all the stories you heard on the news, all the warnings about trusting people you didn't know. But Shepard didn't look like a threat. He looked like a man who'd had a rough day and needed a place to rest. He looked, if Walter was being honest, like the kind of man Walter would have wanted someone to help if it had been him broken down on a strange road. "Spare rooms upstairs," Walter said. "Beds made. Bathrooms at the end of the hall. You're welcome to stay." Shepard stared at him. "You don't know me." "I know you well enough." Walter stood and carried his empty mug to the sink. "You're a man who got caught in a storm. I'm a man who has a spare room. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that." He could feel Shepard's eyes on his back, assessing, calculating. Then he heard a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. "You're a rare kind of person, Walter Hensley." "I'm just a farmer." Walter turned back to face him. "Now, are you hungry? I was going to make some eggs. Got plenty for 2. They ate together at the kitchen table, scrambled eggs and toast and bacon from a pig Walter had raised himself. Shepard ate like a man who hadn't had a home-cooked meal in a while, which made Walter wonder about his life, about the road he traveled, about what kind of person ended up broken down in a ditch in rural Oklahoma in the middle of a storm. He didn't ask. Walter had learned a long time ago that people shared what they wanted to share, and pushing only made them clam up. So they talked about other things, the weather, the crops, the challenges of keeping a farm running in a world that seemed determined to pave over everything green and growing. After dinner, Walter showed Shepard to the spare room and said goodnight. He lay in his own bed, listening to the unfamiliar sound of someone else moving around in the house, and thought about Margaret. She would have liked this, he decided, She'd always had a soft spot for strays. He fell asleep smiling, for the first time in longer than he could remember. What he didn't know was that Shepherd wasn't sleeping. He was lying in the spare bed, looking at the ceiling, thinking about the old farmer who had pulled him from a ditch without asking for anything in return. He was thinking about the farm, the fences, the work that was too much for one man. He was thinking about what it meant to help someone and what it might mean to be helped, and he was making plans. By the time the sun rose over Walter Hensley's farm, Shepherd had already made 3 phone calls, and somewhere across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, 600 motorcycles were being fueled, and 600 riders were clearing their schedules. Something was coming to the Hensley farm. Walter just didn't know it yet. The tow truck came the next morning, just like Shepherd had said it would. Walter watched from the porch as 2 men loaded the broken motorcycle onto the flatbed, their movements quick and professional. Shepherd stood beside them, talking in a low voice, gesturing occasionally toward the bike and then toward the road. When the truck pulled away, Shepherd walked back up the driveway. His limp was better than yesterday, though Walter could still see him favoring the leg. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Walter with those gray eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. "I appreciate everything you've done," Shepherd said. "The room, the meals, pulling me out of that ditch. Not many people would have done what you did." "Told you already," Walter said, "just being neighborly." "Well," Shepherd reached into his jacket and pulled out a card, white, simple, with a phone number and a small logo Walter didn't recognize. "If you ever need anything at all, you call that number." Walter took the card and looked at it. A horseman carrying a shepherd's crook, and beneath it the words, "Iron Horseman MC." "What's this?" he asked. "Family," Shepherd said. "The kind you choose. We look out for each other, and we look out for people who deserve it." He paused. "You deserve it, Walter." Before Walter could respond, a pickup truck appeared at the end of the driveway, the same truck that had followed the tow, come back to collect Shepherd. He shook Walter's hand, a firm grip that lingered a moment longer than necessary, and then he was walking away, climbing into the passenger seat, disappearing down the county road in a cloud of dust. Walter stood on the porch for a long time after he was gone, turning the card over in his weathered hands. He didn't know what to make of it, the strange encounter, the stranger offer, the feeling that something had shifted in the fabric of his quiet life. He tucked the card into his shirt pocket and went to work on the fences. The next 2 days passed the way days always passed on the Hensley farm, slowly, measured in chores and meals and the steady rhythm of work that never ended. Walter fixed the north pasture fence, cleared the debris from the storm, patched the missing shingles on the barn roof. His body ached in the evenings, the cumulative weight of 73 years of labor settling into his joints like an unwelcome guest, but he kept moving. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering all the things he'd lost. Margaret, his youth, the future he'd imagined that had somehow slipped away. On the 3rd morning, he woke to a sound he didn't recognize. It started low, a distant rumble that could have been thunder, except the sky was clear. Walter lay in bed, listening, trying to place it. The sound grew louder, closer, until the windows began to vibrate, and the old house seemed to hum with it. He got up, pulled on his pants and his boots, and walked to the front porch. The county road was full of motorcycles. They stretched as far as Walter could see in both directions, hundreds of them, maybe more, their chrome catching the morning sun like a river of light. They were turning into his driveway, one after another, a procession that seemed to have no end. The rumble of their engines was deafening, a sound that shook the ground and rattled the teeth in Walter's head. He stood frozen on the porch, his hand gripping the railing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This had to be a mistake. This had to be meant for someone else, some other farm on some other road. There was no reason for hundreds of motorcycles to be pulling into his driveway, filling his yard, lining up along his fences like an army awaiting orders. The first bike reached the house and stopped. The rider dismounted, pulled off his helmet, and Walter recognized the gray beard and the slate-colored eyes. Shepherd. "Morning, Walter," he said, as casually as if he'd just dropped by for coffee. "Hope we're not too early." Walter's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind Shepherd, the other riders were dismounting, pulling off helmets and gloves, gathering in groups on the lawn. There were men and women, young and old, all wearing leather jackets with the same patch on the back, the horseman with the shepherd's crook. "What?" Walter managed. "What is all this?" Shepard climbed the porch steps and stood beside him, looking out at the sea of bikes and riders filling the farm. "You helped me when I needed it," he said. "Pulled me out of a ditch, gave me a bed, fed me. Didn't ask for anything in return." He turned to face Walter. "This is us returning the favor." "I don't understand." "You've got fences that need mending, a barn that needs new shingles, fields that need clearing, and equipment that needs servicing." Shepard's eyes swept across the farm, taking in all the work that Walter had been struggling to keep up with. "You've been doing it all alone for 4 years. You're not alone anymore." Walter felt something crack in his chest. Not pain, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a wall giving way that he hadn't known he'd built. "I can't ask you to do that," he said, his voice rough. "You didn't ask. We're offering." Shepard put a hand on his shoulder. "That's 600 brothers and sisters out there, Walter. Carpenters, electricians, mechanics, farmers, people who know how to work and want to help. All you have to do is say yes." Walter looked at the crowd, at the men already pulling tools from their saddlebags, at the women organizing into groups, at the efficiency of a community that had done this before and knew exactly what to do. "Why?" he asked. It was the only word he could find. "Why would you do this for me?" Shepard was quiet for a moment. The engines had all shut off now, and the silence that followed was almost as overwhelming as the noise had been. "Because you represent something that's disappearing," he said finally. "A man who works his own land, who built something with his own hands, who helps strangers because it's the right thing to do. The world's full of people who would have left me in that ditch. You didn't. You saw a person in trouble and you stopped." He paused. "We don't forget that, Walter. We never forget." A woman approached the porch, middle-aged, with graying hair and a kind face that reminded Walter painfully of Margaret. "I'm Ruth," she said. "Shepard's told us all about you. We've got crews ready for the fences, the barn, whatever else needs doing. Just point us in the right direction." Walter looked at her, at Shepard, at the 600 people waiting in his yard. He thought about Margaret, about what she would say if she could see this. He thought about all the mornings he'd woken up alone, all the evenings he'd gone to bed exhausted, all the times he'd wondered if he could keep going. "The north pasture," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Fence came down in 2 places, and the barn roof. Lost some shingles in the storm." Ruth nodded and turned to the crowd. "You heard the man. Fence crew to the north pasture, roofing team to the barn. Let's move." The yard erupted into organized chaos. Groups formed and dispersed, heading toward different parts of the farm with tools and materials that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Walter watched in amazement as strangers spread across his land, working with the practiced efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were doing. "Come on," Shepard said. "Let me buy you a cup of your own coffee. You look like you could use it." They walked inside together, leaving the door open so Walter could hear the sounds of work, hammers and saws and voices calling to each other across the fields. He sat at the kitchen table, in the same chair he'd sat in every morning for 54 years, and watched Shepard pour 2 cups from the pot Walter had made at dawn. "I still don't understand," Walter said. "All these people, all this work, for one old farmer who pulled a man out of a ditch." "It's not about the ditch." Shepard set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table. "It's about what the ditch represents. You could have kept walking that morning, could have figured it was someone else's problem, but you didn't. You chose to help, even though it cost you time and effort and a set of dry clothes." He smiled. "That choice, that moment of kindness, that's what we're honoring today." Walter wrapped his hands around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into his calloused fingers. "Margaret would have liked this," he said quietly. "My wife, she passed 4 years ago. She always said I was too stubborn to ask for help, too proud to admit I needed it." He paused. "She would have liked seeing me proved wrong." "Tell me about her," Shepard said. So Walter did. He talked about meeting Margaret at a church social in 1972, about the courtship that had lasted exactly 6 weeks before he'd proposed. He talked about the early years of their marriage, the struggles and the joys, the children they'd raised and the grandchildren they'd hoped to see grow up. He talked about the cancer that had taken her, the long months of watching her fade, the morning he'd woken up beside her and known that she was gone. Shepard listened without interrupting. When Walter finished, the coffee was cold, and the sounds of work outside had shifted from chaos to steady progress. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman," Shepard said. She was. Walter looked at the photograph on the windowsill, Margaret in the garden, laughing at something he'd said, the sun turning her hair to gold. She was the best part of me. She'd be proud of you, Shepard said, keeping this place going, helping a stranger in a storm. That's her legacy, Walter. That's what she left behind. Walter didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded, and Shepard seemed to understand. They sat in silence for a while, two men who had found each other by accident and discovered something that felt like fate. Outside, the sounds of 600 people working to rebuild a stranger's farm filled the air like music, and Walter Hensley, for the first time in 4 years, didn't feel alone. The work continued through the morning and into the afternoon. Walter walked the property with Shepard, watching in amazement as his farm transformed before his eyes. The north pasture fence, which would have taken Walter a week to repair on his own, was finished by noon. A crew of 20 had descended on it with posts and wire and tools, working in coordinated silence like they'd done this 100 times before. The posts were straighter than anything Walter could have managed, the wire tighter, the whole thing looking better than it had in years. The barn was next. A team had climbed onto the roof at first light, stripping off the damaged shingles and replacing them with new ones that matched so well, Walter couldn't tell where the old ended and the new began. Another team had gone inside, reinforcing beams that had started to sag, replacing boards that had rotted through, oiling hinges that had been squeaking for a decade. But it wasn't just repairs. As Walter walked the farm, he saw improvements everywhere, things he'd been meaning to get to for years and never had the time or the strength. The chicken coop had a new door and fresh wire mesh. The vegetable garden had been weeded and mulched, the dead plants pulled, and the soil turned for next spring. The long driveway, rutted from years of heavy equipment, was being graded smooth by a man on a borrowed tractor. "This is too much," Walter said, stopping at the edge of the south field. "I can't repay any of this." "Nobody's asking you to repay it." Shepard stood beside him, watching the work. "That's not how this works." "Then how does it work? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like 600 people dropped everything to come help an old man they've never met, and I don't understand why." Shepard was quiet for a moment. The wind carried the sound of hammers and voices, the distant rumble of the tractor, the ordinary symphony of work being done. "My father was a farmer," he said finally. "Not here, back in Kansas. 200 acres, just like yours. He worked that land his whole life, alone after my mother passed, too proud to ask for help and too stubborn to accept it when it was offered." He paused. "He died in his barn. Heart attack. They didn't find him. For 3 days, because nobody came to check on him." Walter looked at Shepard, seeing something in his face he hadn't noticed before. The shadow of old grief, carried so long it had become part of him. "I was on the road when it happened," Shepard continued, "running from things I couldn't name, angry at a world that didn't make sense. I came back for the funeral and found out that half the farm had already been sold to pay debts I didn't know he had. The other half went to the bank a year later." His voice was steady, but there was weight beneath it. "I swore then that I would never let another farmer die alone, never let another family lose everything because pride got in the way of community." He turned to face Walter. "That's why we do this. Not because we expect something in return, but because we know what happens when people don't, when neighbors stop being neighbors, when community becomes a word instead of an action." He gestured at the riders working across the farm. "Every one of these people has a story. Every one of them knows what it's like to need help and not get it, or to get it when they least expect it. They're here because they believe that kindness isn't just a nice idea, it's a responsibility." Walter didn't know what to say. He thought about his own father, about the years of working this land together, about the lessons he'd learned without ever being taught. He thought about Margaret, about the way she'd always made time for the neighbors, always showed up with casseroles and condolences and whatever else was needed. "Your father would be proud of you," Walter said quietly, "building something like this in his memory." "I hope so." Shepard smiled, a rare expression that softened the hard lines of his face. "Some days I'm not sure. Some days I think I'm just an old man on a motorcycle, pretending I can make a difference." "You made a difference today." Walter looked out at his farm, at the new fences and the repaired barn, and the people who had come from hundreds of miles away to help a stranger. "You made a difference to me." Around midday, Ruth organized a lunch that materialized out of nowhere. Sandwiches and chips and cookies and enough lemonade to fill a swimming pool. The riders gathered in clusters around the yard, sitting on tailgates and fence rails and the ground itself, eating and laughing and talking like old friends at a reunion. Walter moved among them, shaking hands and accepting thanks that he felt should be going the other way. He met veterans and teachers, mechanics and nurses, parents and grandparents. He met a man who had ridden 8 hours from Texas because he'd heard about the farm and wanted to help. He met a woman who had brought her teenage daughter so she could learn what community looked like in action. "This is incredible," he told Ruth, watching the scene unfold. "I keep expecting to wake up and find out it was all a dream." Ruth laughed. "That's what they all say. First time we showed. Up at someone's place, the woman thought she was being invaded. Called the sheriff and everything." She shook her head. "Took us an hour to convince her we were there to help, not to cause trouble." "How many times have you done this?" "This specifically? Maybe 40, 50 times over the years, but the club does other things too. Charity rides, veterans support, disaster relief. Wherever there's a need, we try to be there." She looked at Walter with kind eyes. "Shepard's been doing this for 30 years. He's not going to stop until he physically can't anymore. And even then, I suspect he'll find a way." After lunch, the work resumed. Walter tried to help, but every time he picked up a tool, someone gently took it from his hands and pointed him toward a chair. "You're the guest of honor," one man told him. "Your job is to supervise." So Walter supervised. He sat on his porch and watched his farm come back to life, watched strangers pour sweat and skill into land they had no claim to, watched something he'd thought was slowly dying be resurrected before his eyes. By late afternoon, the major work was done. The fences were repaired, the barn was solid, the equipment had been serviced, and a dozen smaller projects Walter hadn't even mentioned had been identified and completed. A group had painted the front porch railing, another had fixed the leak in the kitchen sink, and someone had even replaced the broken step on the back stairs that Walter had been meaning to get to for 3 years. Shepard found him as the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I don't have words." Walter's voice was thick. "I've lived on this land my whole life. I've never seen anything like this. You've never needed anything like this before." Shepard sat down on the porch step beside him. "But now you do. And that's okay, Walter. Needing help isn't weakness. It's human." "I know that. Margaret used to tell me the same thing." Walter shook his head. "But knowing it and believing it are different things." "They are." Shepard was quiet for a moment. "When I first started the Iron Horsemen, I thought I was doing it to help other people. Took me years to realize I was really doing it to help myself, to work through the guilt I carried about my father, about not being there, about not seeing what was right in front of me." He looked at Walter. "Every farm we fix, every person we help, it's a chance to rewrite the ending, to say that this time things will be different." Walter thought about that. He thought about all the years he'd spent alone on this land, too proud to admit he was drowning, too stubborn to reach out. He thought about what might have happened if Shepard hadn't broken down on that muddy road, if Walter hadn't heard the engine and walked down to investigate. "You could have died in that ditch," Walter said. "If the storm had been worse, if I hadn't heard you, No." Shepard smiled grimly. "The road's taken a lot from me over the years. Almost took everything that morning. But instead, it brought me here. Brought me to you." He shrugged. "I've learned to trust that things happen for a reason, even when I can't see what the reason is." The sun touched the horizon, spilling light across the fields like liquid gold. The riders were gathering near their bikes, preparing to leave. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and the sound of engines warming up. "They're heading out?" Walter asked. "Most of them. Long rides home for some, but a few will stay. Make sure everything's settled. Do any follow-up work that's needed." Shepard stood, his knee popping audibly. "I'll be back too. Not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but I'll be back. You're on our list now, Walter. That means someone will check on you every month, make sure you've got what you need." Walter stood too, facing the man who had stumbled into his life 3 days ago and changed everything. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You already did." Shepard extended his hand. "The day you pulled me out of that ditch, you thanked me in advance for everything that came after. That's how kindness works. It echoes forward." They shook hands, and then Shepard walked to his motorcycle, a new one, Walter noticed, delivered at some point during the day. He swung a leg over the seat and kicked the engine to life, the rumble filling the yard. "Take care of yourself, Walter Hensley," he called over the noise, "and take care of this land. It deserves to be here for another 100 years. He rode down the driveway, and the other bikes fell in behind him, a procession of chrome and leather that stretched down the county road and disappeared over the hill. The sound of 600 engines faded slowly, replaced by the ordinary quiet of the farm, the wind in the trees, the distant lowing of cattle. Walter stood on his porch until the last sound had faded. Then he turned and looked at his farm, the new fences, the repaired barn, the painted railing, the 100 small improvements that had been made by strangers who had become something more. He thought about Margaret, about what she would say if she could see this. He thought he knew. She would say that kindness always finds its way home, and for the first time in 4 years, Walter Hensley believed it. The months that followed were different from any Walter had known since Margaret's passing. True to his word, Shepard sent someone to check on him every few weeks. Sometimes it was Ruth, who would sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and talk about her grandchildren. Sometimes it was Tiny, the young man with the tattooed arms, who had a gift for fixing engines and had taken a particular interest in Walter's ancient tractor. Sometimes it was riders Walter had never met, passing through on their way somewhere else, stopping in to make sure the old farmer on the list was doing. Okay. At first, Walter resisted. He'd spent too long being self-sufficient to accept help easily, even help that was freely given. But the Iron Horsemen were patient. They showed up whether he wanted them to or not, fixed things he hadn't asked them to fix, left groceries on his porch when he forgot to go to town. Slowly, grudgingly, he began to accept that this was his life now, that he was part of something larger than himself, connected to people who cared whether he lived or died. It changed him. The loneliness that had been his constant companion since Margaret's death began to lift, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: community, belonging, the knowledge that if he didn't show up at church on Sunday or answer his phone on Monday, someone would come looking. He started going to the Iron Horsemen's monthly gatherings, cookouts and charity events, and rides that wound through the countryside. He was the oldest person there by a decade, the only one who didn't own a motorcycle, but nobody seemed to care. They made room for him at their tables, listened to his stories, asked his advice about things he actually knew about, farming mostly, and maintaining equipment, and the particular challenges of rural life. "You should get a bike," Tiny told him one afternoon, working on the tractor while Walter supervised from a lawn chair. "Never too old to learn." "I'm 73 years old," Walter said. "I think I'm exactly too old to learn." Shepard's 61, started riding when he was 50. Tiny looked up from the engine, grease smeared across his forehead. "Says it saved his life. Gave him something to live for when everything else had fallen apart." Walter thought about that. He thought about the years since Margaret's death, the slow grinding down of his spirit, the way he'd started to think of the farm as a burden instead of a blessing. He thought about what it might mean to have something new, something that was just his, that had nothing to do with grief or obligation or the weight of the past. "Maybe," he said, "maybe I'll think about it." He did more than think about it. 3 months after the day the bikers rebuilt his farm, Walter Hensley bought a motorcycle. It was nothing fancy, a used Honda, small and manageable, the kind of bike they sold to beginners who were more interested in getting from place to place than in making a statement. Tiny taught him to ride it in the empty field behind the barn, patient and encouraging until Walter could manage the basics without tipping over. The first time he rode it on the open road, something unlocked inside him, the wind in his face, the rumble of the engine beneath him, the world opening up in every direction, full of possibilities he'd stopped seeing years ago. He understood, for the first time, what Shepard had meant about the road saving his life. It wasn't about escape, it was about connection, to the land, to the sky, to the endless ribbon of asphalt that linked one place to another. He rode every day that spring, short trips at first, then longer ones. He rode to town and back, to the neighboring farms, to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. He would park the bike beside her headstone and talk to her the way he'd talked to her when she was alive, about the weather, about the crops, about the strange turn his life had taken. "You'd laugh if you could see me," he told her one afternoon, sitting in the grass with his helmet on the ground beside him. 73 years old, riding around on a motorcycle like some kind of teenager. "The neighbors probably think I've lost my mind." He could almost hear her response, the gentle teasing, the warmth in her voice. She'd always said he needed to loosen up, to stop taking everything so seriously. She'd be happy, he thought. She'd be proud. In May, Shepard invited him on his first group ride. It was a charity event, a 100-mile loop that started at the clubhouse in Tulsa and wound through the countryside, raising money for a veterans organization. Walter almost said no. He wasn't fast enough, wasn't experienced enough, would only slow everyone down. But Shepard wouldn't take no for an answer. "You're one of us now," he said. "That means you ride with us." So Walter rode. He started at the back of the pack, nervous and uncertain, his hands tight on the handlebars. But as the miles passed, he began to relax. The riders around him adjusted their pace to match his, falling into a formation that protected him without making him feel coddled. They communicated through hand signals he was still learning, checking on him at every stop, making sure he had water and rest and whatever else he needed. By the time they reached the halfway point, Walter was grinning so wide his face hurt. "Not bad for an old farmer," Tiny said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Not bad at all," Walter agreed. The ride ended at a park outside Tulsa, where a crowd had gathered to welcome the riders home. There were speeches and music and food, and Walter found himself surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand and hear his story. The old farmer who had pulled a biker out of a ditch. The man whose kindness had brought 600 people to his doorstep. He told the story so many times that day that he lost count. But each telling felt different, less like recounting a strange event and more like sharing a piece of himself. These people understood. They knew what it meant to help a stranger, to be part of something larger, to believe that kindness mattered in a world that often seemed determined to prove otherwise. That night, after the crowd had dispersed and the bikes had gone their separate ways, Walter sat on his porch and watched the stars come out. The farm spread out before him, quiet and peaceful, the fences straight and the barn solid and the fields ready for planting. Everything looked the same as it had before the storm, and everything was different. His phone buzzed. A text from Shepard. "Good ride today. Proud of you." Walter smiled and typed back, "Couldn't have done it without you." The response came a moment later. "That's the point. None of us can do it alone. That's what family is for. Family." The word settled into Walter's chest and stayed there, warm and unfamiliar. He'd had family once. Margaret, the kids, his parents and grandparents, stretching back through the generations. But this was something different. This was family he'd chosen, or maybe family that had chosen him. Either way, it was real. He put the phone in his pocket and looked up at the sky, at the endless sweep of stars that had watched over this land for longer than humans had walked it. Somewhere out there, Margaret was watching too. He was sure of it. "I'm going to be okay," he said out loud, to her, to himself, to anyone who might be listening. "I think I'm finally going to be okay." The wind stirred the leaves in the old oak tree, and Walter could have sworn he heard her answer. "You always were," she seemed to say. "You just forgot for a while." He smiled, and for the first time since she'd left, the smile didn't hurt. 2 years later, on the anniversary of the day 600 bikers had descended on his farm, Walter Hensley hosted a gathering of his own. It had been Ruth's idea, originally. "You should do something to mark the occasion," she'd said over coffee one morning. "Invite people out, have a cookout, show them how far you've come." Walter had resisted at first. He wasn't the type for parties, never had been. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. A chance to say thank you. A chance to show the Iron Horsemen what their kindness had built. The farm was ready for visitors. The fences that had been repaired 2 years ago still stood straight and strong. The barn roof hadn't leaked since the day it was fixed. The vegetable garden, Margaret's garden, was lush and productive, tended now by Walter and a rotating crew of volunteers who came out every few weeks to help. But there were new additions too. A pavilion behind the house, built by the Iron Horsemen last summer, with picnic tables and a fire pit and enough space to seat 50 people. A small cabin near the creek, designed for visitors who needed a place to stay, riders passing through, veterans looking for peace, anyone who needed what the farm had to offer. A sign at the end of the driveway that read, "Hensley Farm, all are welcome." The bikes started arriving around noon. Walter stood on the porch and watched them come, just as he had 2 years ago, but this time there was no shock, no confusion, just gratitude, deep and steady, for the people who had become his family. They filled the yard the way they had before, hundreds of motorcycles, hundreds of riders, but now he knew their names. Now he knew their stories. Now he understood what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. Shepard was among the first to arrive. He dismounted and walked up to the porch with the same steady gait, the same gray eyes, the same presence that had filled Walter's kitchen on a stormy morning 2 years ago. His limp was almost gone. Physical therapy, he'd explained, and a knee replacement he'd been putting off for years. "Walter," he extended his hand. "Good to see you." "Good to see you too." Walter shook firmly, then pulled him into a hug, something he wouldn't have done 2 years ago, something that felt natural now. "Thank you for coming. Wouldn't miss it." Shepard looked around the farm, at the improvements and the visitors, and the life that had grown from a single act of kindness. "You've done good work here." "We've done good work here," Walter corrected. "None of this would exist without you." The cookout lasted all afternoon. Burgers and hot dogs sizzled on grills, children ran between the tables, and the sound of laughter filled the air. Walter moved among his guests, shaking hands and accepting hugs, telling stories and listening to new ones. He met riders who had been there 2 years ago and riders who had joined since, all of them part of the same family, all of them connected by the same belief that kindness mattered. Ruth found him near the pavilion, watching the crowd with something like wonder on his face. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like a dream," Walter admitted. "Like I'm going to wake up and find out none of it was real." "It's real." She put a hand on his arm. "Every bit of it. You built something here, Walter, something that's going to last. We built it together. That's the only way anything worth building gets built." As the afternoon wore on, Shepard gathered the crowd for a ceremony. They assembled near the pavilion. Hundreds of faces turned toward the old farmer, who had started everything with a simple act of kindness. 2 years ago, Shepard began, his voice carrying across the yard, "I broke down on a muddy road in the middle of nowhere. I was hurt, stranded, and a long way from anyone who knew me. A lot of people would have kept walking, would have figured it was someone else's problem." He paused, looking at Walter. But Walter Hensley isn't a lot of people. He stopped. He helped. He opened his home to a stranger without asking for anything in return. The crowd was silent, listening. "What happened after that? The 600 bikes, the repairs, the community we've built here. None of it would exist without that first moment, that first choice to help, instead of walk away." Shepard pulled something from his jacket, a leather vest worn and patched, with the Iron Horseman logo on the back. "Walter, you've never asked to join the club. You've never wanted a title or recognition. But you've earned something that can't be ignored." He walked to Walter and held out the vest. "This is an honorary membership," he said. "It means you're one of us, officially. Not a rider, necessarily, though you're welcome on any ride we take, but family. Protected, respected, loved." He smiled. "You've been family since the day you pulled me out of that ditch. This just makes it official." Walter took the vest with trembling hands. The leather was soft, worn smooth by years of use. The patches told stories he was still learning to read, chapter names and memorial rides and symbols that meant something to the people who wore them. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "You don't have to say anything." Shepard clapped him on the shoulder. "Just put it on." Walter slipped the vest over his shoulders. It fit like it had been made for him, which maybe, in a way, it had. The crowd erupted in applause, not the polite applause of strangers, but the full-throated cheering of family welcoming one of their own. Ruth was crying, Tiny was grinning, and Shepard was watching with an expression that Walter had come to recognize over the past 2 years, pride, affection, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his purpose and lived it every day. The party continued until sunset, then beyond. As the sky darkened and the stars came out, a bonfire was lit in the fire pit, and the riders gathered around it, sharing stories and songs and the particular kind of warmth that comes from being among people who understand. Walter sat near the flames, the vest still on his shoulders, watching the firelight play across the faces of his family. He thought about Margaret, about what she would think if she could see this. He thought about his parents, his grandparents, all the Hensleys who had worked this land before him. He thought about the legacy he would leave behind, not just the farm, but something more. A community, a family, a chain of kindness that stretched from a muddy ditch to wherever it ended up next. Shepard sat down beside him, 2 bottles of beer in his hands. He offered one to Walter, who took it gratefully. "Hell of a day," Shepard said. "Hell of a 2 years." Walter took a sip, watching the fire. "You know, I was ready to give up. Before you came along, I was tired, lonely, couldn't see the point in keeping going. If you hadn't broken down on my road—" "But I did." Shepard looked at him. "That's the thing about life, Walter. It puts people in your path for a reason. You just have to be willing to stop and help when they need it. And if I'd kept walking that morning, if I'd decided it wasn't my problem, then you'd still be alone, and so would I. Shepard shrugged. But you didn't keep walking. You stopped. You helped. And here we are. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire, listening to the conversations around them. The night was warm, the stars were bright, and somewhere in the darkness an owl called out, a sound Walter had heard 1,000 times on this land, a sound that meant home. "What's next?" Walter asked eventually. "For you, for the club." "Same as always, keep writing, keep helping, keep building something that matters." Shepard finished his beer and set the bottle aside. "There's always another person in a ditch, Walter. Always another farm that needs fixing, another family that needs support. We just have to keep showing up." "And you think that's enough? Showing up?" "I think it's everything." Shepard stood, stretching his back. "The world's full of people who have opinions, who post online, who shake their heads and say someone should do something. But the ones who actually show up, who get their hands dirty, who give their time and their sweat, those are the ones who change things. That's what the Iron Horsemen are. That's what you are." He looked down at Walter. "A person who shows up." He walked back toward the fire, leaving Walter alone with his thoughts. The party wound down slowly, riders drifting toward their bikes, saying goodbyes that weren't really goodbyes because they'd all see each other again soon. By midnight, the yard was quiet. The fire burned down to embers, the farm settling into the peaceful darkness that Walter had known his whole life. He walked the property one last time before bed, checking the fences, the barn, the cabin by the creek. Everything was secure. Everything was home. At the end of his walk, he stopped at Margaret's garden. The vegetables were thriving, the flowers she'd planted decades ago still blooming in the beds she'd designed. He knelt in the dirt, feeling the earth beneath his fingers, and spoke to her the way he always did. "They made me an official member today," he said. "Can you believe it? 75 years old, and I'm part of a motorcycle club." He laughed softly. "You'd think it was hilarious. You'd probably say something about old dogs and new tricks." The wind stirred the leaves, and he could almost hear her response, the warmth, the love, the gentle teasing that had defined their 50 years together. "I miss you," he said. "Every day, but I'm not alone anymore. I've got family again. I've got purpose." He paused, looking up at the stars. "I think that's what you wanted for me. I think that's why you sent him, the biker in the ditch, the storm, all of it. You knew I needed something to pull me back." He stood, brushing the dirt from his knees, and looked at the farm spread out before him, the land his family had worked for 100 years, the home he had almost lost to grief, the community that had grown from a single act of kindness. "Thank you," he said, to Margaret, to Shepard, to everyone who had helped him find his way, for everything. He walked back to the house, the leather vest still on his shoulders, the stars wheeling overhead. Tomorrow there would be work to do. There was always work to do on a farm. But tonight he would sleep well. He would dream of Margaret, of the road, of the 600 engines that had changed his life. And in the morning, he would wake up and do what he had always done. He would show up. That was the lesson in the end. That was what the Iron Horsemen had taught him, what Margaret had known all along, what the land itself seemed to whisper every time the wind moved through the fields. Show up. Help when you can. Let kindness echo forward. The rest would take care of itself. Walter Hensley climbed to the porch steps, opened the door, and went inside. The old house settled around him, warm and familiar, full of memories and possibilities. He was home. He was family. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And tomorrow, somewhere out there, another stranger would need help. Another person would be stranded in a ditch, lost in a storm, waiting for someone to stop. Walter would be ready. He would always be ready. That was what family did.